Today we have the honor and privilege of our own clergy presenting to us. It's with great pleasure I introduce Rabbi Nichols.
All right, hello everyone and Happy New Year. It's nice to be with all of you again. If you were with us at around Thanksgiving, I am all recovered and much healthier, so it is good to be back with you and be zooming in from the office. The upcoming Torah portion, not this week, but the next week, is Parshat Bishalach, the Torah portion with the crossing of the sea. So it felt like an appropriate time for that to be a topic for this group. And I wanted to share a children's story with you first to give you a glimpse into why I chose this topic. Rabbi Mark Gelman tells the story of the dolphins of the Red Sea. And according to his story, the dolphins of the Red Sea were playing and in the water and all excited as they always were until the sea started to split. And then they were quite confused what was happening, and they could see as they kind of stuck their noses out that there was walls of water and then air. And they started to realize that the fish were going to just swim themselves right into air. So they started to swim along the sides of the walls, trying to prevent the fish from going out into the air. But then as the Israelites started to cross, the dolphins got busier because the goats and the sheep that were along with them, the Israelites started to put their heads into the water and disappear into the water. And of course, as soon as they stuck their heads in, they were in the bottom of the ocean. So the dolphins started to also swim along the bottom, trying to get them back into the path, the dry path, and out of the water. And they were swimming along busy and then noticed the Egyptians coming. So they swam backwards and started to use their tails to flick water under the wheels of the chariots so that the Egyptians would get stuck in the mud and held up from catching up to the Israelites. The dolphins were much relieved when the waters came crashing back down so they could go back to their playing and splashing. And that is Rabbi Gelman's version of what happened at the Red Sea. So this story has always fascinated me because it raises the question of what was it like when the water actually split? If we imagine the water splitting, what happened to the fish? What happened to the things on the bottom? What did the bottom look like and feel like? And the text itself does not give us a whole lot. So that's where I started with and wanted to look at text and also art to see what are the different things that people have imagined that this experience looked like. So I'm going to share my screen. And just put out there that the best way to look at images is to have the input of lots of people and knowing what different people are seeing in the images. So I really want to invite you as we start to see some of the art to, I'm going to ask you, and I hope you'll chime in with what you see and what you think. You can do that by raising your hand on the little hand on your Zoom, or putting something in the chat box so that this can be a collaborative process. So this right here is the classic image of what the crossing of the sea looked like. Of course, this is Charlton Heston and the 10 Commandments from Cecil B. DeMille's movie in 1956. And this is kind of what gives many people an idea of what did it look like when the Israelites crossed. And we have here the walls of water and the dry kind of road in the middle. Here is the text. It is from Exodus chapter 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. And you lift up your rod and hold out your arm over the sea and split it, so that the Israelites may march into the sea on dry ground." And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his warriors, his chariots and his horsemen. Let the Egyptians know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. So we have here, and I've bolded it, what we have of the description so far is that Moses is supposed to lift up his rod and hold out his arm, and the sea is going to split, and the Israelites will march into the sea on dry ground. So not a lot of description, right? What does it mean to march into the sea on dry ground? Because if you're marching into the sea, you assume you're getting wet, but it says on dry ground. The text goes on with a little bit more of the preparation, how this is going to work. The angel of God, who had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved and followed behind them. And the pillar of cloud shifted from in front of them and took up a place behind them. And it came between the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel. Thus there was the cloud with the darkness, and it cast a spell upon the night, so that the one could not come near the other all through the night. So to just pause there for a moment, we have this pillar of cloud, and right, God had appeared in a pillar of cloud during the day, and at night it was a pillar of fire, so that the Israelites would always have something to follow. And here we have a description of how this pillar of cloud is going to shift to be from being in front of them to be behind them, kind of between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night, and turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Okay, so here we have some more description for us to think about what it was like. It happens through, Moses holds up his arm, but we also see that God is driving back the sea with a wind, and it happens all night long, and that the waters are forming a wall on the right and on the left. I am not going to read all of this to you. As you can see, I didn't bold anything because this doesn't give us any more description of the sea itself, but describes how the Egyptians follow into the water. The wheels of their chariot are locked up, and then Moses holds out his arm and the waters come back and the Egyptians drown. If we jump to verse 29, it just reminds us that the Israelites had marched through the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. So this is our text description, but it doesn't give us a lot. So I made us a list of questions, things that I wonder about if I'm trying to imagine this. So how did the actual parting of the waters look and sound? We know from our description that the east wind was blowing all night long. So was the water parting, was it really slow or was it fast? Was it loud? You know, when you think of waves crashing, it can be very loud. Was this something that was loud or was it soft? How did the path look and feel? Was it smooth and level or rocky and hilly? Did the path look like the sea floor or the desert floor? So when the water split, it says it was dry. But what happened to everything that was growing on the bottom of the sea? And the bottom of the sea, is it flat and smooth? Was the path flat and smooth, or was it just like the bottom of the sea, but without water in it? What could the Israelites see from inside the walls? So when they looked at the water, what could they see? Could they see through the water? Could they see the dolphins? Could they see the fish? Or was it just dark? Were the walls solid, or could you see into or through them? Did the walls of water move? So it doesn't tell us. We know that it moved to part, but once they were in their walls, was it like ice? Or do we imagine kind of the water flowing all of the time? Did the walls of water make any sound as the Israelites crossed through? So these are questions that I generated, and I invite you to add to our chat box any questions that you might have about what did this look like or sound like, and what did they see? Because those are all the questions that artists have to consider when they're thinking about how do I make this into a painting or a drawing or a movie, so that they can kind of capture that experience of crossing the sea. So feel free to add any questions in there. One more text to give us from Isaiah. Isaiah says, "Thus said the Lord, who made a road through the sea and a path through mighty waters." So I thought that the image from the movie really fits so well with Isaiah, in that it made a road through the sea, that this depiction really gives us just a kind of straight path. It looks smooth and dry, like a road. And through the mighty waters. These waters, in the question that I had asked of, was the water moving or was it like ice? This water looks like it's still churning up there above them. So that fits to me with this idea of mighty waters. Okay. This addresses the question of what did that road feel like? The Mechilta to Rabbi Ishmael says that when it says that God turned the sea to dry ground, but Rabbi Ishmael wants us to know it wasn't totally dry, it was still muddy. And that the waters formed a wall, and it wasn't really a wall. He wants us to know it was just resembling a wall. But then we get another description here of the mud from Exodus Rabbah. In what ways did the Israelites rebel at the Sea of Reeds? It was precisely at the moment when they went down into the seabed and found it full of mud, because it was still wet from the water. There were two Israelites, Reuven and Shimon, who were among the Israelites. As they walked through the sea, all they could talk about was the mud. Reuven said, "In Egypt we had mud, and now here too in the sea we have mud. In Egypt we had clay for bricks, and here too we have an abundance of clay to make bricks." They rebelled at the sea, even though this was the parting of the Sea of Reeds. They didn't notice the water. Instead, they saw the mud. So I've told this story before from Exodus Rabbah as a lesson on looking up, right? And not dwelling on the mud, but looking up to see what else is around you. That there's this message here in the Midrash of so focused on what's at their feet and the negative that they miss the whole miracle. But in our quest to imagine all of this, thinking about, was it muddy, right? It says dry ground, but does dry ground just mean that it wasn't the ocean anymore? Was it really dry? And so that leads me to think about how hard was it to walk through, to walk across. If you think about the beach, even where it's dry with sand, it's very tiring. So what was that walk like for the Israelites? Vicky said it had to be muddy. It didn't have to be muddy. So that's one of our questions. Was it dry or was it muddy? Was it flat or was it bumpy? Were there things that were in their way that they had to watch out for? You know, think about if you've been snorkeling, all of the pointy things that are coming up from the bottom of the ocean. Did they have to step around those things? This painting is a Dutch painting of the crossing of the sea, and it's in a collection at Princeton University. And I paired it with this text about the mud, not because you can see mud in the painting, but because it felt to me like these two men right here, with one with the bag slung over his shoulder, looked almost like the men in the Midrash, looking down at the mud. That it doesn't seem like there's any sense to them of wonder and amazement around them, but they're just walking along, kind of missing what's going on around them. This is kind of a classic example of classical painting, in that Dutch painters are using the outfits that they are familiar with. They're focusing on their study of the human body, not so much what the Israelites themselves would have looked like, but does give us, it's missing for me the emotion of the miracle. And I think that's significant to think about in how we imagine what the Israelites were experiencing. Any other comments on this painting before we move on? Okay. We read before Exodus chapter 14, which is the narrative of the story, but in Exodus 15, we get the Song of the Sea, which is where we get Mi Chamocha, the prayer from. Right? So this is the song that the Israelites sang in praise to God after crossing over the sea. And in the description, it gives us a little bit more of what the sea might have looked like. So Exodus 15:8, at the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood straight like a wall. The deeps froze in the heart of the sea. So the piece that gets added here that we didn't really have before was this part about the deep. What does it mean that the deeps froze in the heart of the sea? Or HaChaim, a commentator, kind of thinks this through, and he says that although the Torah reports that God made a strong east wind blow all night, which dried out the sea, this referred only to the deep waters. God did not want the Israelites to have to descend to the very depths and to have to get tired by walking too far. This is why he first froze the deep parts of the sea by means of the east wind. If not for this consideration, God would have dispensed with the east wind altogether. So this adds a whole different understanding. He's saying if the deep part gets frozen, then the walls of water are only up at the top. So if you imagine the ocean, right, it's shallow right at the beach, but then gets, miles and miles deep as you go, it's going to be kind of frozen all the way across. So then the Israelites have a straight kind of flat path through. And that's how they're understanding that additional idea from Exodus 15 of the deeps froze in the heart of the sea. And also kind of gives us an idea of how is it that they, traversed the sea that presumably would have gotten very deep. Were they having to march down, into the valleys of the ocean, or were they marching straight across? Another explanation of that same idea, the deeps were congealed. He fashioned them into a kind of vault in the heart of the sea. Where is a man's heart located? It is located just above 2/3 of his height. Similarly, the water congealed over them at 2/3 of its depth. The sea had no heart, but a heart was attributed to it. So this is trying to figure out a little bit more technical description. We have 2/3 of the way up the ocean, the depth of the ocean, that's where it froze. So then the Israelites could walk across with the heart of the sea under them and not have to go down. This image, which unfortunately I found it on multiple websites, none of them attributing it to somebody. So I don't know who painted it, but this doesn't give us the idea of the frozen depths, because this gives us an idea of really walking way down, and is I think different than a lot of the conceptions that we have of the splitting of the sea, that Moses standing at the edge is way, way, way above all of the people who are at the bottom. And it's almost, like a canyon split across the whole way. Anything else that you see in this painting? Sarah?
Didn't Moses lead the people across? if he stretched out his arms and the water parted.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to know because Moses stretched out his arm and the waters parted. Depending on different midrash, it's not necessarily Moses who walks into the water first. This gives you more of the idea that like he's holding it open as they start. So some paintings you'll see depict Moses at the beginning with the Israelites going ahead of them, and some of them seem to depict him at the end, kind of waiting for everybody to finish.
Were the people trusting?
Were the people trusting? It's hard to know. I mean, we know they got across, so they were that trusting. There's midrash that says that they weren't trusting, and that it took Nachman ben Aminadab, one man, to go into the water to kind of prove to everybody that it was okay. But I guess for me, that question also raises the question of what the experience was for them. I think you could be more trusting if it was truly dry and the walls of water weren't moving. If it was loud and there was lots of rushing water around you, I think it would have been harder to feel trusting and feel like you could continue walking all of that way without worrying that water was going to fall on you at any minute. Leslie?
Hi, you asked what else did we see here?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that it looks like we see an infinite path, that it looks like there is no end to it. You know, it just, you can't see the other end. You don't know exactly where you're going. And the other thing is the light that comes down and shines on Moses.
Nice. It's great. So two pieces there. One, that you can't tell how long this path is, which, you know, I think adds to the drama of what this experience was like. How far did they have to travel to get to the other side?
Yes.
And then also with the light, really showing kind of that's a way of illustrating God's presence, right, in the painting without having to depict God in a human form.
Well, it also shows God's special relationship with Moses and the importance of Moses himself.
Right. Thank you. We also have a comment in our chat box that it looks like the earth split open and the water went with it. Could this have been a tectonic shift? So there are lots of articles over the years wondering, is there a natural way to explain the splitting of the sea? So scientists and meteorologists have written all sorts of articles about what kind of wind or hurricane could account for what feels like the splitting of the sea. And I think people they only get so far in that explanation of trying to imagine that it would have done it in a dramatic enough way to have an entire people cross. It's kind of hard to imagine. But this does feel like kind of an earthquake with the earth splitting. And the question, I guess, then is, how is the water staying where it is? What I find interesting about this painting is that if you covered up the crack, it looks like a normal ocean with waves. So how is all of that kind of waves going on, but stopping when it gets to the crack? Okay. We have a comment from Nadine. It appears to be a message that the risk of crossing a sea that miraculously parted is preferable to being a slave. Yes, and a question, I think what the Israelites routinely ask throughout the book of Exodus is kind of comparing everything. Is this really better than what we had in Egypt? It was bad. We had these bad things in Egypt, and now we're having them here. And each time having to kind of be convinced that this is worth it to hopefully not be a slave again. And then Lynn writing, can it be that the sea was frozen when the earth split open? So that also could be a way to explain that text from Exodus 15 of that the deeps froze, that when it split, did it then kind of freeze in place? Okay. Here is another one. This is a modern painting, and it was a study for a larger painting that the website where I found this painting says the larger one never happened, but this was a study. And for me, this one gives that idea of dry ground and also the idea of the walls. What it's missing for me is, Bob had asked earlier, another question he would have was how tall were the walls? That this doesn't, it gives you the sense of walls when you're on the path, but you can't really see walls. There's nothing rising above the rest of the ocean. So that I think raises the question of when it formed walls, was it just to part the sea or did it rise up at all? Because our kind of classic image is having it come up above. And Stefan is giving us some geographic context that if it's indeed is 12 miles across, and of course we've done, lots of people have done work trying to figure out where exactly was it that they crossed. So if it's 12 miles across, he's saying it would take about 8 hours to cross, and would give them time, the Egyptians time to catch up, because the Egyptians weren't bringing along flocks and children, right, and all their belongings, so they could move a lot faster. Any other comments on this particular painting?
The clouds look like they're part of the ocean.
The clouds look like part of the ocean. Part of that, I think, is the red color.
Well,
which
just the shapes.
And the shapes, yeah. Anybody else?
It just looks to me like, it looks to me like there's like driftwood on the bottom, which is different than the other images. Like it looks more realistic of what the bottom of the sea would look like.
Great. Okay, so a little bit more of a sense of like having something on the bottom, right? That it's just an empty ocean bottom versus some clear path that has been created.
Right.
And a comment that the clouds are forbidding. Yes, definitely.
Rabbi Nichols,
Yes.
my question really only has part to do with this. What was the intent of God in using this method to allow the Israelites to flee from Egypt to safety? I mean, why did he choose this? He was all-knowing and all-powerful. He could have done it many different ways. Why was it done this way? Have the sages over centuries attempted to interpret that?
Yes, I think they point out, the sages point out that it specifically tells us that they went around to where the Red Sea was. That if you picture the map, you don't actually have to cross the Red Sea to get out of Egypt.
That was my purpose. That was my purpose in question.
Yeah, so that it had to be a conscious choice. I think for me, there's two reasons. And if we go back to God's original instructions to Moses, in verse 17, God says, I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his warriors. Let the Egyptians know that I am the Lord. So I think there's one piece of it is God's desire to prove God's power to the Egyptians, right? That really kind of a large statement on the way out of the slaves. This was done by God. I think the second reason is the effect that it would have on the Israelites themselves, that this gives God a chance to say, look at the miracles that I can do for you, and I'm doing this for you to get you out of Egypt. Because if they just started walking, I think the complaining about the conditions of the desert that they do would have begun so much earlier, and it would have been much easier for them to have just turned around and gone back.
Got it.
I think this also gives that kind of barrier of, we've gotten past the sea, it's gone back down again, and now we're on the other side. There's less of a chance that they're going to turn around and run back.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Walls of water. What do they look like? Rav Kahana says in his text, Rabbi Yochanan sat and expounded how the waters of the Sea of Reeds became like a wall for Israel. Rabbi Yochanan was explaining that the wall of water looked like a lattice, like lattice bars or a net. Sarah Batasher grew impatient and said, I was there, and the waters were rather like transparent windows. So first, who is Sarah Batasher? There is a character, Sarah Batasher, in the Torah, and she then appears multiple times in rabbinic stories that she is a woman who was alive at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. But before that, she was also alive long enough to know where Joseph was buried. And according to the rabbis, she was the one who was able to tell Moses how to get Joseph's bones to take back to the land of Israel. And now in this story, she's alive in the time of the rabbis. So she is this kind of mythical figure alive for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And she hears Rabbi Yochanan, kind of giving a lecture about what it was like, and kind of loses patience and says, I was there and this is what it was like. But it gives us, in our quest to imagine what this looked like, a few different ideas. Did the walls of water look like lattice or a net or transparent windows? Right? I had asked before, maybe were they dark? Could you see through them? And this raises that question. So I have two modern paintings. This first one gives us that sense of translucence with both the colors and the outlines of the sea creatures up at the top. And this is a Kabbalistic painting. So this kind of chart that you see in the middle that looks almost like a bunch of grapes is the map of the 10 sfirot, the different characteristics of God that the mystics talk about. So it's a way of kind of representing God being before the Israelites. And then in the corner, in the top right-hand corner where there are Hebrew letters, that is Yud He Vav He, the name of God. So this gives one idea of what those walls of water may have looked like. Any other comments on this one?
What is the medium that he used?
I am not sure because I've only seen it I've only seen the photo of it. I believe it's watercolor of some kind.
I'm not trying to get too graphic, but it also looks like from the inside a rebirth of the Jewish people.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a definite notion of, right, that this is, they are being birthed as a people. Okay, one more modern one. And this is called Yamsuf, which is just Red Sea in Hebrew, by an artist, Shem Tov Ben Shlomo. And this really gives you a notion of clear walls that you could see the fish and everything in them. And I also wonder, based on the comment earlier about frozen, right, it almost looks like ice capped at the top. And if you really like this one, it is available on Etsy. Can be purchased today. Any other comments on this one?
It shows a very diverse people.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
A diverse people, and also the sense of different ages and all of the things that they must have brought with them. The question of diversity is interesting because the text itself tells us that a multitude of people came along with the Israelites. So even if they were not so diverse themselves, there were other people that came with them and kind of formed this community in the desert. So it's neat to have kind of an image of, right, they're not all dressed the same, they're not all the same size, gives you a sense of this community that's forming as they go. And we have a comment that it looks too calm. Yes, that right, there's not a lot of, it does look like almost the walls of a museum that you can kind of calmly walk through. Oh, and then Lynn comments that it looks like the long hallway of the temple before the renovation with people dressed for the high holidays, right? So that might not then capture the emotion of crossing the Red Sea.
What does Yamsuf mean?
Yamsuf, it just means red. It's just the Hebrew for Red Sea.
Without
read-
the title, it would look like you're in an office building with windows on the side and a blue ceiling.
I think that back here with this shape, and I don't know if it's supposed to be an eye but I think it gives us that sense of God's presence there as well with the light at the end of the, almost like a tunnel. Okay. I wanted to share one more commentary with you. Me'am Loays is a commentary written in Ladino in the 18th century. And in this commentary, he comes up with 50 different miracles that God created for the Israelites between leaving Egypt and getting across the Red Sea. And I pulled out just 10 of them that relate to the sea itself. And he really goes kind of all out imagining what it was like. So first he says, all the waters of the world split as well. There are a few commentators who take the phrase, all of the waters split, that was in our original text, and see it as extra, thinking, why do they need to tell us that all of the waters split? It just told us that the waters of the sea split. And their interpretation of that is that every single body of water in the entire universe at that time split like the Red Sea. Even one commentator says, even water in glasses, that it all split, that this was a kind of universal miracle. So he starts with that here. And then he says the water split into 12 pathways for the 12 tribes. Perhaps he's trying to answer the question, how did we get so many people across so quickly? The water covered them on all sides, including over their heads, forming a tent. The floor became a beautiful mosaic. The water formed crystals, so the tribes were able to see each other, which relates for me to the last painting we saw, where you could see the fish, that if the 12 tribes were on different paths, that they were kind of seeing each other almost through windows. There were fruit trees for mothers to feed their children, and it smelled sweet and not of seawater. From the walls came sweet drinking water. The depths of the sea were leveled. The water formed a floor where it was deeper than other parts. The walls of water stood so high that all the nations of the world were able to see them, and that vegetation grew from the ground for the animals to eat. So he really takes the imagining to a new level of kind of a magical world that was created for them as they crossed the sea. Number 9, with the walls of water standing so high that the nations can see them, I think that gets us to the idea of, why did God choose this miracle of crossing the sea? That if one of God's goals was to prove God's power to the other people, that imagining the walls of water being so high that you could see them for thousands of miles gives us that sense that everyone is awed by this miracle and not just the Israelites standing there. Leslie asked in the chat box, there were no tribes yet, ? There were tribes. The tribes were formed from the 12 sons of Jacob, who went down into Egypt. So by the time they leave Egypt, those 12 men have now formed generations of families who are the start of the 12 tribes. And of course, they're not as large, but they continue to grow, but they're already talked about as tribes throughout the journey through the desert.
On that point, we know at some point that numbers, the Hebrews are about 600,000 men. And do we have any idea from the Bible what the number was of who actually crossed?
So it's hard to know, because it seems like when you do the math, that if there were 600,000 men when they took the census in the desert, then that would have been about 2 million people altogether once you count in women and children, which is just an astounding number to try to imagine either crossing the sea or, frankly, having that many people in the area that is the desert. So it's a number that's hard to know what to do with, given the setting. We know that they were very organized in tribes, and that's how they set up their tents. But if you try to imagine, 600,000 men divided into 12 tribes, those are still very large groups to be organizing.
Right.
Harvey Smith went to like a yeshiva.
Okay. I want us to go back to the original text and just see some of the of how it happened within God setting it up. The angel of God, who had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved and followed behind them. And the pillar of cloud shifted from in front of them and took up a place behind them. And it came between the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel. Thus there was the cloud with the darkness, and it cast a spell upon the night, so that the one could not come near the other all through the night. These images of the angel of God, of the pillar of the cloud, and of the darkness really come up in a lot of the paintings. Here is one by Marc Chagall, and he produced many versions of this painting with different color schemes, and this is the one that is in the collection of the Jewish Museum. And you can see here both the angel at the top. There also seems to be an angel holding a Torah, as well as the clouds that are separating the Israelites at the top from the Egyptians at the bottom, and the darkness. So it gets all of that image of kind of what was the setting for the sea splitting. This one is by Raphael, and it's in the collection of the Hermitage Museum. And we get here the pillar. So it's a much more literal reading of pillar than a pillar of cloud that we might imagine. It is like there is a pillar right there, but that is kind of God separating the Israelites from the Egyptians. What I think is interesting about this one, and a number of the more classic painters that we'll see a couple more of, is their emphasis on what happens to the Egyptians, and also the proximity of the two. I guess I always had the sense that because it says that then water comes crashing down, I guess I'd always imagined the Israelites all on land and then seeing the water come down over the Egyptians. But many of these paintings really make it seem much more kind of treacherous, and of how close they came to being caught by the Egyptians, that we have the Israelites kind of still stepping out of the sea here.
Almost total chaos.
Yes, definitely, right? And you have just the churning of the water and the people kind of pushing each other in arms and legs, this sense of chaos. and certainly chaos that the Egyptians were experiencing themselves. This one is an
I think though that it has to be clear that the Hebrews could not have just walked there, kind of, oh, we're out for a nice stroll today. I mean, it had to be frightening. It had to be, you don't know how long the walls are going to hold up. You don't know. It's always testing faith in God in this religion, and that certainly is a point of it. And then, of course, what happens then to watch the Egyptians drowning, as much as you may have hated them, it's still a roiling type of experience.
And a sense of, look what's happening to them. That could, 5 feet ago, that could have been me. But I think the kind of classic image of the walls and the flat path lose some of that sense of emotion, Bob, that you're talking about, because it had to have been frightening. It had to have been, nerve-wracking of how long is this going to last? And just the difficulty of moving all of your kids and your animals and your stuff. And right, all of that makes it across. There is not like, let's leave stuff. We're going to just leave things along the way as we rush. It all makes it across. And the Mayam Loaiz's image of fruit trees that are growing so mothers could just give their babies fruit. Another commentator has that same image of like children are crying and that moms can just reach out into the water and like pick things that are going to feed their children and kind of keep them happy and moving along. This etching, I just wanted to bring because the pillar of cloud was so distinct, and gives a really different image, I think, of the water as well, that you have a sense of kind of these waves that are almost frozen in place. But the tops of the waves almost look like clouds themselves.
It's as Lynn said, it looks like tornadoes.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I think Lynn was even commenting about the clouds in this one, but it becomes almost more tornado-like as we go, right? That this pillar of cloud is almost like it sucked the water up to create the path. This painting is in the Sistine Chapel. There is very large disagreement about who the painter is, so we're just going to say unknown. But it's the Sistine Chapel, and it again, and the image here is dark. Right in the middle is a nice pillar, a classical architectural pillar, but that is representing God for us. And right, it really is marking the line between the Israelites on the shore and the Egyptians in the water. And I think what's also highlighted here is the sense of kind of the relief of the Israelites in the fact that they are already, here's probably Miriam playing her instrument. There's a little pet dog in the corner, that they have kind of already relaxed as the Egyptians are still kind of roiling in the water here. And in the background, a reference to an earlier part of the story with the plagues, but gives this sense of the right side of the picture is total destruction and the left side is the Israelites going off into freedom. Sarah.
Cannot the light at the end of the path and also the white cloud among the dark clouds be representative of God rather than the pillar?
Yes, I think that's probably another way to show God. I think we have to account for the pillar as something, because it's there, but God, sends the pillar of a cloud, but maybe the cloud, the light and the clouds are also giving us a sense of kind of God's presence over all of this whole experience. And Nadine has commented dread versus hope by the use of color. Yeah, there's definitely kind of brighter, happier colors, right, on the Israelite side versus the dark colors of the Egyptians. Okay, here is another one with similar ideas. With the Israelites have safely reached the sea. And here we don't see as many Egyptians, but there are remnants of what Egyptians have, both an Egyptian and the shield, kind of what's washing up on the shore as evidence of what's happened to them. Again, we have the difference with color, right, of the dark black in the corner. And here I think we get a little bit more of a sense of the aftermath in terms of the Israelites giving thanks, that we have people pointing and kind of arms up in the air, that there's more of a sense of gratitude to God for this miracle than we saw in some of the other paintings. This one is by Bronzino in the 16th century and is in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And is, again, as I commented on one of the earlier ones, is one of these examples of, I think, a Renaissance painter who's also focusing on scene and setting and putting in both costumes and poses that are certainly not appropriate for the scene, but part of their painting style. And in the front right corner, you see Moses, and this is actually included in this scene, is both the scene of the Red Sea crossing and Moses kind of ordaining Joshua as the next leader. And just one more Dutch painting, which in the background on the right side, you see the walls of water, and a kind of a different depiction in that it almost seems like the very end of the crashing back down of these walls of water that are just crashing on the end of the Egyptian army as the Israelites watch on. And Nadine has commented that Moses had horns in the last painting. He does. This comes from the misinterpretation of the word Karen, which can mean horn or rays of light. When Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, the Torah says that his face shone with rays of light, and a mistranslation of that to horns is how we have multiple depictions of Moses, particularly the most famous being Michelangelo's statue of Moses having horns, which leads to then the stereotype in fear that Jews have horns that they are hiding. But here it is depicted in Moses having rays of light. And it's interesting, this depiction, they almost look like rays of light, but they're situated with only two of them, right, where you would have horns. So it kind of crosses both parts, both options for the translation. Okay. I want to end with three modern depictions and ask people to share what they see in them that are all quite different than anything we'd seen before. So this one is Louisa Chase in 1983. And I'm curious to hear what people think about the hands that are depicted. There are larger hands and there are also some smaller hands, and to hear what you think those hands are. Where are we in the narrative in this painting? Sarah.
I interpret it as people drowning and reaching up to try to get air because of the turbulence of the water.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sarah, are they Jews in your mind or are they Egyptians?
Egyptians. And look at the person in the back left corner with the horror in his face. It's more of a horror of death rather than life.
Okay. It raises a question for me that with all of these, the classic paintings as well, with the focus on the Egyptians, that I'm curious about. Why do we think that so many artists have chosen to focus on the Egyptians versus the miracle of the crossing itself?
People always focus on the negative over the positive.
Okay.
But it may not always be the negative. God very purposely went out of his way to lead the Jews into the water and to bring the Egyptians behind them so that he could prove his power.
Mhm.
And it just goes along with the entire process of the plagues, especially the last one, where the importance of that firstborn to the Egyptians. In every home, the firstborn was the priest of the house who handled all the sacrifices and all the daily feeding of the items that led to the ancestors. And ancestor worship was the heart of Egypt. So when God struck at the firstborn, he wasn't just striking at literally, oh, we'll take your sons away, but also totally against the whole religion of the state. And this just continues. And I think, God doesn't want you messing with him.
And so perhaps power is proved more through destruction than through kind of positive miracle.
I think it's the horror of people dying. And, it brings to mind that comment about how God is in dismay. He's upset that his people are also Egyptians that died. And that people that part of a world that he created, had to suffer like that.
Thank you. All right. This one is by Michael Bogdanow, who is, and I don't have an exact year. It's called Exodus. It was painted in the 1990s. And what do you think he's trying to depict here?
Is he Russian?
He is not Russian. He lives in Lexington, Massachusetts. Was a member of my temple where I grew up.
Because
Don't
if
be
you look at
Russian.
the peoples also, I mean, a lot of them could be the African Jews who came out, which also might relate to comparing it to the civil rights movement here, and people of color seeking freedom.
Well, and it's the right time period to be depicting all of the different Jewish communities that were kind of making exodus from wherever they were experiencing oppression. So that certainly fits with what's here, that there's such a diversity of people depicted.
They also seem to be very relaxed. I mean, as compared to other depictions of the parting of the sea, they look like what we would hope would happen in this country, and diversity on a pleasant day. Otherwise, walking slowly, some well-dressed, like the man in the bowler hat. It looks like a bowler hat, etc. It's a very, very interesting modern sort of wish, more than anything. I think it's very original.
Yeah. All right, and one last one. This is in the Smithsonian collection from 1978.
At times it's hard to see the figures. It looks like a bridge from coming around.
It looks like confusion to me.
There's a lot of things mixed up in this. I believe that in the upper left-hand corner, we have the Egyptians kind of tumbling. And then it does look a little bit like a bridge, this path that the Israelites are on down here. Coming through the middle, right, that Nadine just commented on is a hand. So I think that God is depicted here with a hand, but also kind of in the hand up here is look like pyramids. So there's for me, there's an idea of this hand kind of coming down and separating really the pyramids, and the Egyptians are on that side. And now Moses is leading the Israelites to this other side.
The composition reminds me of Picasso's Guernica, particularly with the horse on the left and so on, and that sweeping gesture, curves gesture that occurs there. In that particular case, in his particular case, it's the bombing of the German Luftwaffe of the village, and in this particular case, it's actually a hand of God rescuing the Jews. But it's somewhat similar. It probably was inspired by that painting, and the vocabulary of color itself, which is black and white, is also the same.
Thank you, Stefan.
Mm.
All right. I'm going to stop us there. And thank you for participating. I hoped when I asked at the beginning that people would listen, and you did. Thank you for sharing your ideas. And I encourage you, as the story comes up in our Torah, but also as it comes up with Passover, to think about this experience and how you would depict it. And I encourage you to think about what are the moments or emotions that you would put in, whether you feel that you have artistic talent or not. If I made you draw something right now, what are the pieces that you would want to put in? So thank you, and everyone be well.
Happy
Thank
New
you.
Year, Rabbi Beth.
Thank you very